and Israel to have a solution in Palestine that does not involve Hamas, that involves the civil voices in Palestine, and finally have a Palestinian state. But the question is whether Trump is going to stand up to Netanyahu's bombing in Gaza, stand up really to Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who are pushing Netanyahu to continue this. And I really hope that he will. And the Congress can say we don't want to continue to fund it.
Thank you very much for joining us, Congressmember Ro Khanna, Democratic Congressmember from Silicon Valley in California, introduced a bipartisan Iran War Powers resolution. Happy birthday to Karen Ranucci. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
The viewpoints expressed in this program are the opinions of the people expressing them, and not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
Hi, this is Al McFarlane, host of The Conversation with Al McFarlane. You're listening to 98.3 FM, KFAI, Minneapolis. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. And as always, kudos to Amy Goodman. What a powerful and wonderful voice and analysis she brings to the community, to the world. I'm so pleased to be following her on this station every Tuesday. Thank you for being a part of the program, The Conversation with Al McFarlane. If you're listening here on KFAI, or checking us out online at kfai.org. We're also streaming on several social media platforms. We're streaming to the YouTube channel of the Black Press of America, the Insight News YouTube channel as well, and to Facebook, LinkedIn, and X. So however you connect, we appreciate you. We thank you for being a part of this conversation. We want to grow it. And if you are online, jump over to the Insight News YouTube channel and become a subscriber, like, and share. Let somebody know that you're here. Again, thank you. As always, we promised a robust conversation, and today is going to be no different. One of the ideas that we want to talk about is, wealth building, legacy wealth building, and philanthropic planning. I'm pleased to have joining me friends and colleagues from the, first of all, from the Greater Twin Cities United Way, Shannon Smith-Jones. She's the Senior Vice President of Community Impact of Greater Twin Cities United Way. And I have the pleasure of working with her close in depth. I serve on the board of United Way and currently serve as the chair of the organization. And what a great organization it is. What a great team Shannon and her colleagues have assembled, all to serve our community, to serve it deeply, richly, better, and they do great work. One of the things we want to talk about today is how we, as a community, look at wealth creation and legacy wealth, wills. How do you preserve wealth? How do we become the philanthropist that we are at the highest level, at the best level? So, let me tell you a little bit about the United Way, just to get it started. The organization focuses on solutions in housing, food, education, jobs, and areas that are, we say, deeply interconnected. One of the things we have in mind is talking about building intergenerational wealth. And we want families to be able to pass something down. We have to do that, ensure that they have a strong foundation to stand on. And so the Greater Twin Cities United Way unite community partners to meet urgent needs and to make lasting change. And together, the mission, the vision is to mobilize communities to action that allows us all to thrive. Well, good afternoon again and welcome. I'm so pleased to be here and to have this conversation about something that's critically important, something we need to make dinner table conversation in all of our families and all of our communities around town. Shannon Smith Jones, welcome, sister. So good to see you, as always. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's so good to be here today. It's good to see your face. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's always enriching and enlightening to connect with you. You've got such a powerful presence in the community. The job you have is an important job, and you impact so many families in our community, so many people that work for the organization. So kudos to you for stepping up to assume that mantle of leadership at Greater Twin Cities United Way. But let me say that you didn't just start doing that. You've been doing this a long, long time, and you've been engaged in the community, and even more, and it's to the point of today's conversation, what you do in community and have done is really legacy work. You come from a family, a line of people that have been serving community, making our community, making our society better. So I want to just say that to start with and have you introduce yourself, sort of lay out your pedigree, who you are, and why you're able to have this conversation with Al McFarlane.
Well, thank you, Al, for such a wonderful introduction. Again, Shannon Smith Jones, Senior Vice President of Community Impact at Greater Twin Cities United Way. And some of our work is really around changing systems. And that means together with partners, we create a future where income, place, no longer predict a person's ability to thrive, right? And so place or race. And thinking about that in the legacy, right? So we do systems change and immediate needs. And it's not about just the what, sometimes it's the how, right? And so when you talk about the legacy and the pedigree, yes, my uncle was a superintendent of the Minneapolis Public Schools. My aunt was a social worker at Phyllis Wheatley. My sister's in the work, my nephew's in the work, my mom and my grandma were both Sunday school teachers. There is a way of giving into community, and financial wealth is one, but also giving your time and talent and community is another way of continuing to share your knowledge and build wealth. And so it definitely is part of my DNA, so to speak. And so I'm super excited to be here today to talk about not just ways and things that we should talk about around building wealth, acquiring wealth, what that really means, but making sure that we're prepared in a way that we can continue to leave those legacies for our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and that we have the knowledge so that we understand how to engage in these systems that might not have come up around our dinner tables in our households, around how do we keep grandma's house, or how do we not end up in probate and some of those things. So I'm super excited for this conversation.
Well, it's wonderful to have an expert join us in this conversation. Let me introduce our second guest today. Rounding out this conversation is attorney Ivory Umanah. You're going to correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name properly, Brother Ivory. But he's a founding member of Engelmeier and Umanah. It's a highly respected law firm. He's been in the business 25 years, focusing on estate planning, on business advice, on probate law. And he's worked with individuals, families, business owners on everything from trust and succession plans to tax audits and guardianship matters. He's known for his thoughtful counsel, his deep expertise and commitment to helping clients make confident, informed decisions about their legacy. So that kind of sets the stage here. And, guys, as I see it, this will be a classic conversation with Al McFarlane. We are in conversation here, sharing information. And I approach this, Shannon, by being very personal with you and very personal with Ivory. But I know that this personal contact and conversation, this intimate conversation, is one that we're sharing with thousands of people listening on KFAI. And that's the beauty of the thing. So we can be direct with each other. We can question each other, challenge each other, support each other, explain and really illuminate the high points of the conversation, knowing that we are having this conversation in a stage that brings an entire community along with us. So I have fun doing this show, and I thank you both for being here. Ivory, let me ask you to take a minute to introduce yourself again. I've given a little bio, but talk about your work as an attorney.
Thank you, Al. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be with all your growing members in the larger KVI community. I am Ivory Umanah, as Al mentioned. I do estate planning here in Minneapolis, Wisconsin, and pretty much the surrounding communities in the 2 states. I've been doing this for quite some time, and I have to be honest, it is a conversation that should be had, and nobody should ever overlook this conversation. But it's not an easy conversation to have, but it should be had by everyone and every family. I am pretty much a tireless advocate at this point for having these conversations, because if you don't have it, you never understand how it is that other groups or other communities were able to build wealth. If you don't know, I always say this to people: if you don't know, you don't know. And once you get yourself knowledged up, you understand how that process works. In the area of estate planning, I've been doing this, like I said, for over 25 years now. Here in Minneapolis, I went to school here in Minneapolis. So I'm pretty familiar with the community. I do a lot of talking all around the community, and I'm always happy to talk about this stuff whenever I'm called upon. I know that we have a full program today, so I'm going to save some time for that process and leave my own personal qualifications to the side at this point.
Sure, certainly. Well, that's a good beginning. Let me start then, Shannon, to ask you to sort of set the stage here by defining what we mean when you and I are talking about legacy. What does that mean for Black people, for our community?
Legacy is a lot, right? We're talking about money, but we're also talking about what we left behind for our community to build upon, right? It's that knowledge, it is cultural practices, it is ritual, right? I think about the legacy of my uncle, right? Like Richard Green was the first Black superintendent in the Minneapolis public schools. There's a legacy there. There's something to look at, reference, be proud of, and pull from. There's a knowledge base there, and the storytelling and the not allowing that narrative and those stories to die is really important. Otherwise, our legacies get lost, and who we are gets lost. And so there's something to be said about that, but also the things that we have built, whether it's a body of work, whether it's a home, whether it's a business, that we are passing on the tools that our grandkids and our future generations can continue to build upon what we've built. And we lose a lot somewhere in there, right? And systems have forced us to lose a lot. And so the fact that we have so much in this country, that we have what we have, is really good, but we got to continue to have these conversations so that we can continue to stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, build upon the greatness that they've done.
I can't pass up the opportunity to throw some praise towards my mentor, your uncle, Richard Green. And you don't know this, I didn't share this with you last time when we talked, but when I first started Insight News, we started in 1974 as a magazine. I worked for a printing company in Northeast Minneapolis. We got the first copy printed, and I came by North High School to show him a copy. He was the first person ever to ask me for my autograph, and I gave him an autographed copy of the very first edition of Insight News. Now, why is that important? So here I am, a kid who wants to do something, wants to be something, and here is an elder, a wise man, a leader, the principal of the school in North Minneapolis, telling me that what I was doing was important. And it stays with me. So legacy is really important. Shout out to Richard Green and to your whole family, because that's how all of you all operate. You enable, empower people. So legacy.
Yes.
What are the community level impacts when we don't have knowledge, particularly knowledge about wealth building? One thing that we don't do enough, I believe, and that's why we want to have this conversation, is talk about wills and trust, how to pass assets along. I don't know anybody who hasn't had a family story where people were just unprepared, unaware, didn't have the knowledge. And so somebody dies, a house, property, personal property ends up in a probate court. I mean, what is a probate court? We'll talk about that today as well. But how do we, what is the impact when we don't have a roadmap and a community-wide plan that reaches individuals and families about wealth transfer? Shannon, what do you think?
So I think on a level, doing this work that I've done for so long, you see folks who have these immediate needs, right? They have things around them and they don't know how to pull on them, right? And so what happens, and also being in this sandwich generation where I'm in this space where elders have passed away and we are trying to navigate like all of the things that they had or didn't have that we thought they had, right? Not knowing where they are, spending the amount of time that's there. And a couple things happen. We lose something that we've built, right? That the family has built, you're losing it. It's gone, right? If you don't have the right tools in front of you or access to those things, their debt could be where they're taking the home because the debt exceeds, and then that's kind of gone, right? Like this, everybody thought we would get the house and we don't get it. Maybe grandma didn't own the house and we thought she did, right? Like, does she have an insurance policy? Where is it? Do we know who has access to where the things are? And so I think what happens is it impacts the immediate family, but it also, if they don't have preparation, what it does is this new generation of folks who are trying to take care of burying grandma or doing those things are now pulling out of their own wealth that they may or may not have, right? In order to give grandma that going home service that we wanted to give them. And so being prepared helps us, one, hold on to what was built and also not lose what we already have in pulling from the current generation's resources. And so I think I see it showing up. And it also creates spats in families, like, just to be honest, like there is an emotional toll and a relationship toll that happens when things aren't well thought out and prepared for. And that causes rifts that sometimes last way longer than they should.
I have the same story happening in my family where people had misinformation or no information, and you end up developing hard feelings and people don't talk to each other after someone has passed. Ivory, jump in if you would. So what is it that we need to do as communities? There must be a primer, an ABC. And why is it, Ivory, what have we not done as community, as mothers and fathers and grandparents, as churches, for example, and as civic organizations that has not given us the tools, the language, and the confidence to be planful and execute in our best interest around the difficult topic of transferring wealth through wills and trusts, et cetera?
Yes, that is a conversation. That's the point of all of these conversations. That's the reason why we try to have these conversations, is that these are not easy things to talk about. And a lot of people kind of get mired in some of the myths that surround this process. And so when you get stuck in that myth, it's hard to come out of it. And that includes even your own parents, your own grandparents, the church, like you mentioned. People are not willing to allow that process to be spoken about. And so, without that knowledge, I say it sounds like a broken record. Without that knowledge, you're always going to be prone to make the same mistakes. And the mistakes will just pass from generation to generation to generation to generation. Every community, no matter how wealthy they are today, they started somewhere. They started at some point. At least think about it. Think about it this way. For those that came to this country, for instance, on a voluntary, let's take the ones that came on a voluntary basis to this country, right? Most of them had nothing. You know, you hear the stories all the time. They came with nothing, and they started and they built and they built. You know, they didn't build just to consume in the present day. You know, they thought about what happens beyond them. And that's the process that is breaking and missing in some of our communities. People do not think beyond themselves at the moment, or they make assumptions that certain things will happen kind of organically or naturally when they're not here, or certain things will happen if they become incapacitated. These are all things that they don't happen that way. You know, if you don't make this plan, if you don't take the time to think through these basic things, you know, unfortunately, the laws of our society has its own plans for you. If you don't plan, this is how you have that break. You lose everything that you worked hard for. And then the next generation is not able to take advantage of it. See, when you take a simple example, you own a home, right? And you are in a second or third marriage or something like that most people are today. And you either have children in a prior relationship or children now, you know, and so you assume that things will just flow naturally. I cannot tell you how many times people are shocked that that's not how it works, because you never planned as to how you wanted it to happen. You know, if you don't make that plan, you know, you have the privilege, the opportunity to do that. But if you don't, something else will happen. You know, there's a different point for you.
So,
if you
Ivory,
don't put it together.
why don't our people plan? There are myths around that, I think. But let's stop
They
for a
are.
second. And
They
what
are.
have you heard? You must have heard 1,000 stories of why
Correct.
somebody didn't plan. Tell us some.
Correct. You know, the most common myth is I simply don't have enough to be bothered with it. You know, if you think you don't have enough to be bothered with it, that's a problem. You are alive. You're making something. You're creating something. You're not just breathing air. You're living somehow. That means there's some resources that's making that process happen. Isn't it a great thing to make sure that same knowledge that lives inside of you should go to the next person? You know, if you think that you're going to make this work because you figured it out in your head and you don't put it down, it stays in your head. If you become incapacitated all of a sudden, who's going to pull that out? The government will make its own plan because nobody can pull it out. If you die, certainly nobody can pull that out. See, so if you are concerned that, oh, I don't have enough, I'd say do an inventory of your whatever you think you don't have, because that's a starting point. And you'll be shocked at how much you have and how important it is for whatever category of assets you have to be able to move to a certain group of people. You know, we're talking about building communities here. If you are able to think through some of these things, you can ask yourself, do I want this to go this way, or do I want this to go that way? You can either send it to your family or send it to the larger community. The community of charities, they do a great thing by maintaining the community, helping those who cannot help themselves. That's what the charity piece of it's all about. So you never think to just kind of abandon what you have and leave it up to chances, because it never ends up where it's supposed to go. If you believe, for instance, another myth is, well, my wife will just have it. Will she? You know, people are surprised, you know, when they come to me and they say, well, you know, my husband passed away or whatever, and we own this home. You know, I'm like, are you sure you own the home? Let me see the title to the property. And they bring the title. The title is in the name of the person that just passed away. Okay. And that's a big problem because they believe that it should just come directly to them. But it doesn't work that way. If there's a child from somewhere else, that child is the ultimate owner of that property. And people get shocked, incredibly shocked that that is the problem. You have to go get permission from that child in order to be able to dispose of his property. And do you really want to dispose of that property? Perhaps you don't. Perhaps there's a way to preserve that thing, because the legacy that starts from you a lot of times is the home that you leave behind.
Mhm.
What the next generation will be able to do with the value of that home. If it's not burdened by a lot of debt, that next generation will be able to have something that eventually maybe they can dispose of and have money to be able to get what? A down payment on their own home, which will have an ever increasing value. And this is how these things compound. This is how these things go. If you don't start somewhere, it never gets the opportunity to do that building. We're talking about building wealth. That's how it's built. It goes, it starts with you and it goes up and up and up in the next generation. But if you never started, or at your starting point, you didn't do the planning, so the thing gets dissipated, then it doesn't go anywhere. It ends with you. And that's unfortunate. That's the unfortunate part of what happens to a lot of communities. You have these situations where these things don't get the opportunity to pass along. And, the third major thing is that, well, I've got this debt, even though I have this debt, it'll just go away when I die. Okay. Unfortunately, again, that's not how it works. Some debts do not die with you. They stay on and they burden the people that you left behind. So once again, you didn't leave them anything, but now they got your debt on top of your head. So you're constantly moving backwards.
Explain more of that, if you would, Ivory. How can someone else's debt find you and complicate your life? How does it work?
Well, if you have a parent, for instance, that, unfortunately, yes, they own a home, but unfortunately, at some point in their lives, they ran, either they ran out of, or their other financial assets began to dwindle. So they approached the government for help, for benefit in paying that all important health insurance or medical care, right? The government will provide that. But once it does, it takes a lien on that property. It's not necessarily going to tell you we're taking a lien. But if you don't know that the law allows them to have a lien on that property, you won't know what happens at the end. See? So by statute, they have a lien on that property, even though they haven't told you that. They're helping you, and you're thinking it's a good thing. They're paying my bills, and therefore my house will just go to my children. It will not. Because when you're gone, the government comes along with their pink slip. They want their money. And, unless there's certain special circumstances that come into play, they will take that house. And, again, people are shocked that happens, but it happens all the time, and there's no way you fight them. It's just not, because it's statutorily provided for them to be able to do that. And it's hard for people to swallow. But again, this is a process where something that was supposed to move forward is now moving backwards. See? So these are the kinds of problems that you run into every time. And you try to tell people, by appropriate planning, whether it's by will, which we'll talk about what that is, whether it's by will or trust or some other designation, to have the property move along, rather than just kind of going in a direction you never intended it to go. That is, those are some of the myths that come into play when we're dealing with folks. And, unfortunately, talking about this stuff is not going to make you all of a sudden die tomorrow. That's a huge myth as well. You don't want to talk about death, because, you're just going to go once you start talking about it. Right? So we tell people, think about it this way. If that bothers you, just take your mind off of it. Think about it as an insurance policy. You buy insurance. You don't buy insurance thinking I'm going to step out and get killed.
Well, you buy insurance, maybe. Listen, I can tell you, Ivory and Shannon, I'm 77 now, but I have to confess that when I was like 22, 23, I was young and stupid and invincible. And the invincibility was the reflection of my stupidity, right? And so I actually I have this conversation in my mind now that I regret ever having had with a North Minneapolis insurance company. Some of you listening will know Bernie Glover. His agency was up on West Broadway, I think, or maybe on Lowry Avenue. But he called on me when I was 22, had a good corporate job, and I thought I was everything, that the world was waiting on me. It was my oyster, and I owned the pearl, etc.
Right.
And said, what kind of insurance do you have? I said, why do I need insurance? Insurance is for people that don't have confidence in their ability. And so I just, kick myself in the butt right now for having been that dumb. I should have known better, but I did not. And so I say that, I confess that, because I want other people to look at their own stories of how they've approached or failed to approach their life, their future, and their planning. And so have you heard other people like that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I'll just, part of what we do now, is not just reviewing, the current assets that you have when I'm doing any kind of talking or planning with people, is to offer up, suggestions and opportunities to shore up certain things. Mm-hmm. I have to admit that some people now are starting to get at least the insurance piece of it. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest advice that I think is important to give people is, if you have a young child, for instance, mm-hmm. This is a good way for you to set them on the path mm-hmm. of understanding, what it means to either insure something or plan for something. If most people now, at least the ones that I deal with in my planning work, I advise them, if you've never thought about it and you have a young child, that is the best time to purchase an insurance on the life of that child. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Why is that the best time?
It is the best time because the child is young, right? When you get old, you see other considerations come into play when you're trying to buy insurance. Things can come into your life, illnesses or disease or whatever can happen. And unfortunately, insurance company, they're there to make money. They're not, yes, they'll pay up grudgingly when the time comes, but they necessarily aren't trying to insure people who are basically on their way out, right? Mm-hmm. Or they think that there's something wrong. So it's cheaper if you have say a universal whole life permanent policy for a child. Mm-hmm. Small amount. It doesn't have to be a big amount. And the premiums are going to be manageable.
What's a small amount? Let me be practical. What is a small amount?
Well, a premium, say, depending on the size of the policy, correct? Depending mm-hmm. on the size of the policy, you can be paying, a few $100s, or maybe $1,000 in an entire year to buy a $25,000 permanent policy for a child, mm-hmm. right? Your child is, a young person. Mm-hmm. They don't really, there's nothing. They are the perfect candidate for an insurance company. But the premium stays the same mm-hmm. in most instances, right? The premium stays the same. And when the kid grows up to be a certain age, that child can take that policy, and that'll be that child's beginning policy, and that child can take it and run with it. And they'll keep it at the same level, right? At the same premium mm-hmm. when they're older. Mm-hmm. So now, that gets them into the mindset of, hey, this is a good thing, mm-hmm. To have. If it's a permanent policy, it builds some level of cash value in it. So there's all these different benefits. And what's cash value? It's there. It's your money. You can either borrow against it, or, it's just there as extra money for you. If you ever kill off the policy, you get that back, get that portion back. So these are all ways to kind of add to that pile of wealth, the things that you can continue to pile on for later on in life. People have used those techniques to even pull money out, depending on the size of the policy, later on in life, to pull money out to send it, a child off to college, So there's all these different benefits to making this planning, you see. So, your story about overlooking, the opportunity to purchase insurance is, could be partly because this is not something you were exposed to or told by someone that this is important. This is an important tool in your toolbox to have. If you knew that, then, you're super healthy, you had a good job, all these different things, you could have just gotten it because how important that is. You could have locked it in. But when you find out later, okay, I'm ready now. All right, the same agent will tell you, so am I, but let's look at other things.
Yeah.
Right? Let's ask you some questions. And here's what the premium is going to look like now, since you waited however many years to do this. See, so, these are all part of how we educate people to come out of the kind of current mindset that you need to be at a certain level in order to understand certain things, or you need to be at a certain wealth level in order to do certain things. No, it's really just not that. The easiest estate to administer later are some of the largest estates, because these people made all these steps along the way. So somebody passes away, everything just kind of slots into place. It works perfectly fine the way you wanted it to work. And, in some ways, when I help people create plans like that, I don't benefit from it later because it just works. But if you have a disjointed stuff going on everywhere, beneficiaries not properly designated, things not properly set in place, guess what? That's where it becomes very expensive, to administer an estate like that when someone passes away, because it was not ever arranged the proper way.
I'm Al McFarlane. You're listening to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm pleased to have, you just heard his voice, my guest attorney, Ivory Umanah. He is a principal at the law firm. What's the full name of the firm here?
Engelmeier and Umanah. Yep.
Engelmeier and Umanah, and specializing in estate planning, business, probate law, and also Shannon Smith-Jones, who's Vice President for Community Impact at Greater Twin Cities United Way. And Ivory, the next question for me then is a definition question. We've heard the term probate. What does probate mean? And how do we get our community aware of what the particulars, the landscape is that we have to navigate when we're looking at legacy and wealth transfer?
Correct. Before you go to probate, right? The starting point is what we were just talking about, the estate planning part of it. Okay. If you had to define an estate plan, it is a process. It's not a static thing, right? So you start somewhere, or you take certain actions, you do certain things, all of this to ensure that if something happens to you, unfortunately, then what you're thinking about your assets is exactly what's going to happen, right? So when you put those things on paper, whether it's by way of a will or a trust, it's supposed to happen that way if you pass. If your choice of planning, if the tool that you pick out of the toolbox is a will, right, then that is a document that gets administered in accordance with the statute of wherever it is you live. And we happen to be in Minnesota. Minnesota has its own statute, right, that deals with how you dispose of assets that come to someone through a will. Okay. That process is what we call probate. That is where we pull these things together and we find somebody that you wanted. If you had a will, and we'll talk about what happens if you don't. If you had a will, you will designate an individual to say, hey, if something happens to me, I want you to be in charge, right? You being in charge means you get to go to court and you get to tell the court, hey, this person has passed and here's what he left behind. Give me permission to take these things that he left behind, pay his bills, and then hand it over to all the people that are supposed to get it according to his will. That is that process of go to court, ask for permission, get appointed, collect the assets, and then pay the bills and then pass it on. That's probate, that whole thing. That's a bunch of things that I've just mentioned, right? Go to court, ask for permission, get appointed, find out the assets, pay the bills, and then distribute it. That's 6 things I've just mentioned. That whole process, it's a thing that you have to do one after the other, and that thing gets expensive. It's very, very expensive because you're involving a court now. Now there's a different set of things that need to happen. When you involve a court, if you've ever dealt with the court system, the processes that you have to go through. You have to send notices to people. You have to tell people stuff. So if you were thinking, I want this thing to just privately go here and here, that's not going to happen. Because now, once you go to court, the courts ask you, did you tell everybody else? And you said, well, I told this one or that one. No. Did you tell everyone that's connected to this person? If you didn't, then you have to go back and tell everyone.
And there's a process for getting everybody.
Right. You tell everybody that's connected. When I say connected, it means related. And we all have extended families. So you're mailing out notices to people. He has passed. If you have a problem, here's your chance to talk. And you know what would happen, right? Now you're invited people to come and tell them that, oh, this is what he actually said to me, or this is what he wanted me to have. And then, but if somebody comes along and says, oh, this is what he wanted me to have, but he wrote down something else in a will, now you got a different problem. So now you got a dispute, right? So now you got a trial that has to happen in order to determine who's telling the truth. And whether this document that this person signed, he signed it properly, or he followed all the correct steps when he signed it. Because there are things you have to do if you're dealing with a will. Right? It has to be witnessed by 2 people that are not related to you, basically. 2 people that are not getting something out of the estate. In other words, if I'm the one getting something from the estate and I'm the one making my dad, for instance, draft up a will and give everything to me, the heck with my siblings, is that a good will? Not really, but he works for me. And it's up to those siblings of mine to come and bring their grievances to the court. If they don't, but in order for them to bring the grievances, I have to give them notice, right? I can't just do this in, kind of backdoor kind of thing, So if they don't bring their notices and bring their grievances, the law says, well, I gave you 4 months to come and talk to me, and you didn't, so you're done. But 4 months is a long time, right? Because that's how long you have to leave it open. Until people are able to bring all their grievances. Creditors are able to come to the court or send a demand to be paid because this person owed them money. And guess what? So does the government. They come in and say, well, there you go. Here's our bill, right? So all these things are laid bare because it's supposed to be an open process. By the time you start something that should have just taken a month to finish, now you got years and it's still meandering and winding its way through, and you got lawyers involved, and that means you have to pay them. And eventually, even the people that were supposed to get the money will start getting mad at people, and unfortunately, the lawyer is one of them. We're paying you too much. Why didn't you just stop this thing? You have the ability to stop it, because that's the way it was. You gotta go through.
I actually have a question, Ivory. You're talking about the cost of lawyers and all of these things that it costs, right? When I'm thinking about my work that I do at United Way, right? And all of the different communities that I serve, some of the communities are low wealth communities. Are there services out there that are low cost or available for folks to navigate some of this that are out there that anybody could know about if they're listening?
They are, but I preface that with, depending on what you're looking for.
Okay.
If you're just looking for information and knowledge, there are different ways to get it. Even most lawyers, myself inclusive, if all you want to do is talk initially about where your situation is, people will grant you the opportunity to at least get the knowledge that first meeting, right? But if you ask them to do stuff, because even the mere process of filing a paper in court, you have to pay the court to put the paper in there. They don't just take whatever you put in there, right? So all that cost needs to be borne by somebody, right? And so there's always a cost along the way. Even if you're getting free information, there's usually always a cost. Okay. So if you are in a community of low wealth, as you mentioned, then that is the opportunity to find out alternatives to this process, how you avoid this process altogether. See, and that's a nice segue that you just put up there. How you avoid all of these things altogether, because you can do it and you don't have to deal with the courts, right? If you designate people the right way to take whatever you leave behind, then there's no court involved. If you have property and you deed it properly, then there is no court involved, because once you do those things during your lifetime, you take that process, you take that asset from being a probate asset to being a non-probate asset. See, non-probate assets are things like, life insurance policies where you properly designate a beneficiary. And that beneficiary is who you want to take that thing. That money, which would otherwise be a probate asset, now becomes a non-probate because you designated something. If you deed a house, for instance, to the right people, right, you take that house outside of probate and it goes directly as a non-probate asset. So there's different ways that you can do these things. People have utilized different things. There's a transfer on death deed that also works. You have to know how it works, but that's also an instrument that you can use. You can give things away during your lifetime, whether it's to people or whether it's to charities. You can do these things during your lifetime. You can pretty much, if it's your intent to die with nothing, you can die with nothing, but you have to plan it and make sure it happens during your lifetime and everything is gone. We use trust for those with money. We use different kinds of sophisticated trust to transfer asset into that instrument when that person is still alive. In some instances, they may still be able to somehow benefit from that trust. But the point is that you've alienated that asset from you, so it's no longer yours. And if planning for medical assistance is important to you, or important to whoever, then that is one way to do it. Because there's a timing that's involved there. If you don't get this done within a certain period of time, it really doesn't matter, and all of these things require you to get the knowledge that you need. So if you have the knowledge, like I said, what you know. Once you know how these things happen, if something happens to you, you can take care of it in a lot of different ways that would then eliminate the need to spend all this money in probate afterwards.
Shannon, let me go to you and ask you to talk about why it's important and why United Way is putting on its desk, getting this information out to our communities. You mentioned the term low wealth communities that we serve and are working with to build wealth in. And Attorney Ivory, you mentioned ways that you can dispose of assets that give benefit to community through donating to organizations. What's the intersection here? Shannon, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. So one, it's important because I think people see us as a grant giving organization, right? For folks who have immediate needs, which is true. And I also think about things beyond that immediate needs and what are all the other ways that we can help support folks. And one of those ways is retaining and building wealth. And so knowledge is power. And how do we participate in a way beyond the dollar that's going to help continue to build community up? But leading to Greater Twin Cities United Way, another way is, as Ivory mentioned, if you want your gift to live beyond and legacy, right? The work. I had a mentor tell me once, I was struggling asking people for money, right? In this way, especially like in their wills. It felt very like wrong in some sense, right? Of saying like, I'm asking, I'm not considering your family, all these other things you have going on. And she looked at me so sweetly and said, honey, you're just helping people do in death what they've always done in life. Right? If you have someone who has contributed to an organization or have a philanthropic heart and have been giving in many ways, you have the opportunity to continue your legacy in death of what your living legacy has been in life. And that's supporting organizations that have contributed to the betterment of community. And so there's people can leave in their wills money towards an organization that they align with in terms of their values and activities. And that is a way of continuing your legacy. And it feels full circle because we started out this conversation with that, but what better way to think about like, I am able to gift beyond my humanity, beyond my life in this way. And so that is another way. And I have a really small story real quick that there was a deacon at our church and Deacon Staley. And I never thought of Deacon Staley as like a high wealth person, right? But big heart, showed up in all the ways that you want. Like he was grandfatherly. And upon his passing, the church got his house. And out of that gift, they were able to build out a youth center space, right?
See.
And there are many ways of thinking about what does that look like and knowing and being able to continue that story of this is a person who showed up in life, all of the ways that was in giving in community and still was like, how do I do this? How do I plan well so that my assets aren't caught up in court or caught up in these spaces and that my intentions are clear? And so that is a way that has opened up. When that woman told me that, it opened up my mind in a different way of being able to say, yes, like we want to be able to continue doing the things and continuing our desires to move on past our lives. And that is just another way of being able to do that.
Well, so I'm glad, Shannon, that you have told that story. I was glad to tell my story about lack of information, lack of understanding as a 22-year-old. And Ivory, how important is it for us to have these conversations? How do we change the future? Because I think we're talking about, when we use the word legacy, not only ourselves and our immediate families, not only the next generation, we're talking about what happens 2, 3, 4, 5 generations out. Can we shift our thinking to that level as a community so that we do things now with an intentionality that reflects that we are conscious of the impact of today's actions 100, 200 years from now? Is there any evidence of that in our community? And if there's not, how do we create it? Shannon, you and Ivory respond if you would. But Ivory, go first if you would.
Yeah, it's everything just kind of starts somewhere. Like I said, you start the process. It may seem daunting, like it's not taking hold, but it is. It is. At least in the few years, well, if you want to call it 25 plus years, few years that I've been practicing this, I've seen the shift. I've seen people actually take this thing seriously. I've seen people send to me, their own siblings, right? I've seen parents send to me their own children as they've grown. right, to talk to me about setting something up for themselves and their family. So it's starting. The process is slow, but it's starting. But we cannot stop. We cannot rest on the little bit that has happened to this point. It's still a big, huge gap. So this thing has to continue. The process has to continue. The talking about these processes has to continue. And I'm a big advocate for talking with even younger people, the ones that are usually ignored when these types of topics are being done. These are the people that you have to plant those seeds in their head. Okay. For those in the audience that have younger children, invite them to participate in knowing what you're doing. If you do a plan and you stick it in a cupboard somewhere, no one knows, nobody's ever heard of it, and everybody thinks one way, and then something happens to you, and lo and behold, there was this old dusty stuff that's sitting over here that he wanted.
Sure.
And things have changed over time that makes that whatever it is that he or she wanted no longer really just tenable, because either a particular asset has already since been sold or moved on, but it's still being referenced in the document.
Shannon, let me ask you to jump back in here. So how do we create a community conversation? How do we make this? I was pleased that you talked about getting over the feeling that you were being invasive in talking to a person about her disposition of her assets after, but you learned of the power and the benefit of that in the story of the deacon who enabled the church and the community to grow, right, by willing his property. How do we activate that conversation broadly in our community? And how can United Way, for example, among other organizations, support this kind of conversation and facilitate people being engaged in a way that's planful, that is results oriented, and that they can see and feel good about? What do you think?
I mean, this conversation, right? Like the more and more we have these, I think we need to have them in our faith communities, right? Where are the places that we gather? How do we have these conversations and start having these conversations in our homes? So our young people are knowing, hey, I have a plan. This is what it looks like. You're the beneficiary. This is what this, we need to have those conversations. The other thing that hit me as you were asking that question is, why are these the myths? Why are these the things? Why did this become our narrative around keeping these things silent? And how do we demystify that myth? Because silence always keeps us sick. Right? It never is like the thing that is going to free us or liberate us or get us into a space of knowledge. And so that silencing or that muting of our story also feels like a tool that has been used against us in order to get access to wealth, right? Think about how many houses are given up through probate that the city gets back or a bank gets back, or all of these things that our family members have worked so hard for their entire lives, and that their family or organization that they would have given to does not get to reap the benefits of that. And so I think it's saying the quiet part out loud and saying it often, and being able to ask the questions, and then understanding how much things cost, even small things, like even thinking about a $10,000 life insurance policy, right? How small is that cost for folks that don't have a lot of money, so that we can better be prepared, if something tragic happens in our life?
We're down to the last minute, but one of the notes for today's program struck me as powerful. And I'll have you talk about it if you would, Shannon. How do we approach financial planning as an act of love and liberation?
how do we do it as an act of love and liberation? I think we do it with curiosity, and we continue to do it with love. Bring it up in the spaces, continuing to have more conversations like this, invite folks in, introduce folks to Ivory and their firm to be able to say, I actually know someone who you would be comfortable with because I know them and we are very relational. And so being able to build on those relationships, I think is important. And I think it's important to talk about it in communities that aren't considered wealthy. Because,
and we're out of time. I gotta go. Shannon Smith Jones, Greater Twin Cities United Way. Thank you so much. Ivory Umanah, attorney Ivory Umanah. Thank you so very much. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.
See you.